David, please be excellent. I'm Jessica Townsend. I'm the Land Use Administrator for Southbury. The Planning Commission is collaborating with staff from the Land Use Department in the creation of the Affordable Housing Plan. This workshop will conclude promptly at 8 p.m. after a brief question and answer session. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the Chairman of the Planning Commission, Rich Tierdow.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Good evening. The Planning Commission has taken much consideration in tailoring this plan in Southbury's specific needs for its unique character. The workshop tonight is intended to gather information and really encourage the public's input to be included in this plan. To ensure the best outcome for the town of Southbury, the Planning Commission is contracted with SLR Consultants for the establishment of the Affordable Housing Plan. Robert Collins and Karen Martin are with us this evening from SLR and will begin the presentation of all the information and data that we've collected so far. Robert, we're ready to pass the mantle to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. And as Rich and Jessica indicated, my name is Robert Collins, and I'm with the consulting firm of SLR. And my colleague Karen Martin is with us tonight as well. And we're going to be leading you through information and a session about affordable housing. Karen, do you want to go ahead and share the screen and start the presentation?
Yep. Can everyone see that?
Okay, let's go to the agenda then. Okay, so tonight our agenda is that we want to first introduce the subject of about affordable housing and specifically what Connecticut State Statute 8-30J means. And then more specifically, what does this actually mean for Southbury specifically? After we have that initial introduction, we're then going to go through a review of resources or tools that we have put together with the help of the Planning Commission, as well as the survey that was conducted recently about affordable housing. We're going to review those, the survey results. We're going to go through some of the existing conditions, and then we're going to look at the housing needs assessment. And as I indicated, these are all tools that we'll be using to kind of crafting potential strategies that will end up in the final plan. And that we hope that you find them interesting and maybe learn something new about the town that you didn't currently already know. The third thing that we're going to do tonight is actually have potential strategies to be included in the affordable housing plan. And those strategies that we have worked and discussed with the Planning Commission that we'll be sharing with you tonight, we want to get your feedback, and we'll actually be having some live polling related to those strategies after we introduce them to you. And we'll explain a little bit more about that shortly. And then at the very end, we're going to leave enough time for some question and answer so that we can get some, answer any questions that you may have regarding the information that we've shared or other questions that you may have about housing affordability. So tonight, your role is primarily to learn. We're hoping that, as I mentioned before, we're hoping that you actually maybe learn something new about affordable housing, maybe learn something that you didn't already know about your community, and that we're hoping that you find that information interesting. We also want you to provide us with information and input about the potential strategies that we're going to share tonight about your that could be included in the affordable housing plan. And then lastly, we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for folks to ask questions about the subject and about the material that we will be presenting tonight. It's important to note that questions can be put in at the bottom of the screen. You'll notice that there's a Q&A tab, and that you can click on that tab and you can write your question. We won't be answering questions necessarily unless they're easy questions and they will be being typed in the chat. If not, we'll gather them all at the very end and we'll go back and we'll review and answer the questions. Also, if there's questions that might come up later, there's actually going to be an email that we'll share with you at the end of the presentation that will allow you to submit your further questions, and then we'll get back with you shortly on them and post them on the website. As I also mentioned earlier, there's going to be live polling related to the strategies at the end of the near the end of the workshop tonight. So please grab your smartphone, a tablet, or open up a second window browser and have it ready so that when we get to that, we can transition to that live polling at that point. Okay, so let's start with an introduction and kind of talk a little bit about exactly what is affordable housing. Typically, affordable housing is defined as housing that costs less than 30% of a household's monthly income. And that is income that is below the area mean income. So what exactly does that mean? There's acronyms in there. What is monthly, 30% of monthly income, those types of things. But the real aim here is that what the state and what we're hoping to have in the Southbury Affordable Housing Plan is that we create housing affordability options. But this is specifically targeted for households that earn at less than the median income for this part of the state. And it's also important that this housing is attainable and sustainable for these groups, and that it costs no more than a third of what that household earns. Now, there's two different types of affordable housing. There's there's naturally occurring affordable housing, and this is housing that is basically at market rates. There's obviously a naturally occurring affordable housing in Southbury today, and we're hoping that this process of developing an affordable housing plan will actually increase naturally occurring affordable housing. But there's also protected affordable housing, and this is what the state is very focused on. And this is affordable housing that is reserved specifically for low-income occupants, and it's restricted through deed restrictions or subsidies that, again, cost no more than 30% of that household's income. So who is affordable housing actually targeting? We talked about area mean income, and in area mean income, there's both folks that are functioning below that area mean income, they're also moderate income folks, and there's also higher income earning folks. But the real target here, based on state statutes, is that we're looking at folks that basically make less than 80% of the area mean income. I think in a little while, when we share information about what that means, I think there'll be some surprises about who those folks that are actually being targeted. But this can also include not only individuals and families, but also renters and homeowners. It also includes both young families just starting out, as well as senior households. And it also includes local workers. So why is this important for us to consider? It's important to consider because households that spend too much of their income, which is typically more than 30% on housing costs, are considered cost burden. And when a household is cost burden, that means that they don't have enough disposable income left over for other necessities like food, transportation, and clothing. We probably are all familiar with folks that might be cost burden in this particular case and may struggle with these types of necessities. And then lastly, the affordable housing options help low-income households become, it helps them from becoming cost burden because of the high cost of housing in Connecticut. And that's the reason why the state is wanting us to focus on this particular subject. Now, affordable housing can come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And there's not really necessarily one size or one approach that needs to be considered when we talk about providing affordable opportunities. We want to make sure that we look at a full range. And affordable housing can be owner-occupied, a single-family house. It can be a private rental apartment. It could be an accessory dwelling unit, or it could be a mixed-income, medium-density community. All of these types of options are available for further review on the website or story map that is actually located on the town's and the planning department's or the land use department's website. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later if you would like to learn a little bit more about the different types of affordable housing. So let's talk a little bit about the actual statutes that are in Connecticut. And there's two crucial pieces of legislation that kind of set up specific housing affordability goals and targets. And many of you may be very familiar with these statutes already. And the first statute in the Connecticut General Statutes is 8-30G. And this goes back all the way to 1989. It's been around for a long time, and a lot of folks don't even realize that. This particular statute basically set up the housing land use appeals procedures associated with affordable housing. It actually defined protective units that we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. It also established the percent of set-aside units that communities, if they were affordable housing development that a developer would have. It establishes how many set-aside units that development should have. It also sets the income limits and the cost maximums, and that income limits is the 80% of AMI that I mentioned before, and the cost maximums is the 30% that it would cost no more than 30%. So that's where those two things are specifically coming from. It also indicates that if a town has more than 10% protected units, which they've defined, that they are then exempt from these potential developments coming into your community from a developer that might end up being contrary to the zoning code and other things, and then can be go through that whole appeal process that you might be familiar with. So that's been going on for the last 30 some years. And in the next important statute is 830J. And that came out, was passed by the Connecticut legislature in 2017. And this was basically put in place to try to help communities get to more of that 10% so that there was more affordable housing across the state, and that each community would take their time, develop a plan, and figure out what type of affordable housing or what types of affordable housing goals would be best for their individual community based on their individual situation. Now, these plans are required to be adopted by June 1st of this year, and that's why we're talking about it tonight, and we'll be working on developing the plan by June 1st. And then also, the other crucial thing is that these plans will be updated every 5 years. So the plan that we're going to be working on, that we're talking about now, and that we'll be adopting by June of this year, is really the first in the stepping stone of the town of Southbury creating affordable housing options that suit its purposes. And that every 5 years, you'll be able to check back in and decide if you're going in the right direction or if further changes might be needed. Now, since the state legislation for 830J does not give any kind of mandates or any kind of very specifics, the state has put out an affordable housing plan guidebook. And this guidebook, which is shown in the lower right corner, basically gives us some guidance for how we should develop the plan for Southbury. And in the state legislation, they basically want it to be a bottom-up approach to help increase the state's affordable housing supply. If each of the 169 towns in Connecticut put together a plan and take steps to increase affordability, the hope is that in the near future, the state of Connecticut will become much more affordable as when it comes to housing. The state wants to see action goals that are action-oriented, which we will discuss a little bit more in a few minutes. And each community also gets to decide what strategies are best for their community. In the actual plan itself that we'll be developing, there's going to be a community vision statement. We're going to identify and review local zoning laws and the current plan of conservation and development. We're going to conduct a housing assessment, which we're going to share with you tonight. And then we're going to develop goals and strategies and action to be put in the plan to be implemented over the next 5 years. We also will apply best practices and case studies and things like that. So what does this all really mean for Southbury? Let's go back to the definitions that we talked about at the beginning, and let's actually put in real numbers for Southbury specifically. So if we look at a household that has a size of 1 or an individual, and that individual is making less than 80% of AMI, the yearly income for that particular individual would be less than $56,000 per year. Now, for a household of 4 making less than 80% of AMI, that would be a household making less than $80,000 per year. And some of you tonight may fit into those categories. And in this particular case, the state is saying, let's look at those as the lower income folks that might be cost burdened, that might need some help with affordable housing. And then on the far right of the screen, the monthly housing budget that would a household of 1 could afford, it being no more than 30% of their income, would be about $1,400 per month. And for a family of 4 at that rate and no more than 30%, it would be just under $2,000 per month. It's also important to note that housing costs does include mortgage payments or rent, property taxes, utilities, which we know are going up in the state. It may include HOA fees if you're in a condo community, and it also includes maintenance costs. So most importantly, tonight, this is the opportunity for us to begin having the conversation and to begin to create affordable housing plan that reflects Southbury's values and priorities. And the thing that what is giving us our marching orders, so to speak, or our values and our vision statement is the plan of conservation and development. This is the growth management document for the town. And so therefore, since we're talking about housing, it's got to mesh with the POCD. Now, the current POCD does date from 2012, but we know that most of the priorities that are in there are still valid today, even though we're undertaking a process to update and refresh that by the end of this year. But there are conservation-related goals, development-related goals, and infrastructure goals that are within the current POCD. But most importantly and overarching is that there's a desire in the POCD for a strong conviction that Southbury must continue to retain all remaining elements of our historic and rural character. Now, specifically in conservation, there are conservation goals, a total of 5 that are within the current POCD, and they relate to such things as trying to preserve open space and permanent open space, as well as protection of quality of water and related to watershed. There's also some development related goals that talk about maintaining the current pattern of the development with core villages and outlying rural areas, as well as maintaining a balance of housing opportunities. And then lastly, related to infrastructure, it's important to remember that the current POCD talks about avoiding the extension of public water supply systems within Southbury, and also continuing the successful operation of the sewer avoidance program. So these are all values that have been previously established by the POCD, and with this current housing plan, we're still being guided by them. So where do we begin to start to develop this plan that we are wanting to develop as a community? We have a series of resources or tools that I mentioned at the beginning that's really to help start the conversation. And each one of these items is its own tool and resource, and not one is more important than the other. But basically, it gives us information for us all to start to consider what different strategies we may want to pursue for the town. We have the community survey that was just recently completed, and we're going to talk about some of the results from that shortly. We're also going to do a quick zoning analysis where we're going to look at the town zoning and see what opportunities and limitations that may offer us. We're also going to look at demographics and take a look in the recent past, as well as take a look in the future to see what the demographics might be telling us as to who might be best to be targeted for housing opportunities within the town. That will be then coupled with then looking at housing trends so that we see what kind of housing exists today and what housing may be best looked at for the future. And then lastly, we're going to conclude with a housing needs assessment. And this will basically help us pinpoint what housing needs are being met and which ones are being unmet. So with that, we're going to now start getting into the various resources, and we're going to start with the community survey results. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Karen, who's going to go through the survey results for us.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who responded to the Southbury Affordable Housing Plan Community Survey. It was a very successful survey. We ran the survey online as well as with some paper copies distributed out throughout town in January and February. We had a really great response level. We had about 1,200 respondents submit their responses to the survey, which is about 6% of the total population of Southbury. So that was really great. And the larger the response rate, kind of the more accurate and the more diversity of answers and thoughts and contributions we were able to include. So that was really great to see. This is just a quick overview of some of the conclusions and themes we're able to draw based on who answered the questions to the survey, and gives us a little bit of a sense of what types of people with what kinds of characteristics were participating in the survey. About 38% of respondents were longtime Southbury residents who've lived here more than 20 years. About 38% of the survey responders were 65 years and older. About 34% were adult couples with children. About 38% were people who are currently living in a two-person household. 71% of all of the respondents currently live in a single-family dwelling. And 24% of all of the respondents to the survey identified that they live in Heritage Village. The remainder lived in the other neighborhoods that make up Southbury. About 91% of the respondents own their own home, meaning about 9% are renters. 72% of people said that they see themselves living in the same home that they live in today in 5 years. 34% of people said that they know someone struggling with housing costs, which means that the remaining 66% are not currently aware of anyone who may be struggling with housing costs. 43% of people said they were not aware of any affordable housing that exists in Southbury today. So that kind of just gives you a flavor. There was an open-ended question to the survey asking what makes Southbury a great place to live. And this graphic is just a compilation of people's open-ended responses, showing that there are just many, many assets and many reasons that people have chosen to live in Southbury. And the idea here is that there are a lot of amazing factors and assets to Southbury, and we would like to be able to create opportunities for other people who may not currently be able to enjoy living in Southbury to create some new options for them. One of these questions was, how do people feel about how much types of housing Southbury has that fall into some of these different categories? So people were asked to identify, based on these different types of housing, do you think that Southbury has too much, about the right amount, not enough of this type of housing, or are you unsure? So when we looked through these responses, about 51% of people felt that young adults are in need of housing in Southbury. 47% of people felt that low-income households are in need of housing. 47% said that singles or individual households are in need of housing. But about 52% of people said there seems to be enough housing for empty nesters, and 68% of people felt that there is enough housing for young families. This question asked, do you think that Southbury is doing enough to add affordable units towards meeting the state housing goal? So Robert previously discussed that the state under statute 8-3G has a goal in mind for communities in Connecticut to reach 10% of affordable housing of their total housing stock. So this question was asking, how do people feel about that? 43% of respondents said that they think Southbury is not doing enough currently to meet that 10% goal. 14% of people said that Southbury is doing enough to meet the goal. And then the other answer choice was, do you feel that Southbury should even be prioritizing reaching the 10% goal? And about a third of everyone who responded said that Southbury should not make it a priority to actually even meet the 10%. Then there was a question that said, if you had a choice in the type of affordable housing that could be constructed in Southbury, what types of options would you most prefer to see? And the three choices, and we did include these photo images in the survey, were small single-family homes, townhomes, or a multifamily unit building. So as you can see, a majority of people, 59%, said that they would prefer to see small single-family homes. About a third were in favor of townhomes, and only about 7% of people were in favor of multifamily buildings. Then lastly, there was another open-ended question that said, what do you feel would be the potential benefits to Southbury if housing diversity was increased? So people wrote in a lot of different types of responses, and we just went through the responses and collected what some of the common themes and answers that we saw. So some of the top benefits that people expressed that they felt would be brought to Southbury if there were more housing options would be the ability to attract younger residents, particularly families and children, enable seniors to age in place, increase the overall diversity of residents, whether that be socioeconomically, culturally, racially, age-wise, et cetera, enable employees who work in Southbury but can't currently afford to live in Southbury to live where they work, and to allow people who grew up in Southbury to remain in Southbury if they're currently feeling that they're priced out and young people might not be able to remain in Southbury. Housing diversity and options would allow them to do so. So now we're going to move into the next part of the presentation, which, as we explained, is going to start off with a planning and zoning review. So I'm going to pass it back to Robert.
Great, thanks, Karen. Appreciate that. And thanks for going through the review of the survey results. So the most important planning document that we have that guides us for developing the affordable housing plan, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the current plan of conservation and development, or the POCD. And then specifically within that, I believe it's chapter 12, specifically talks about housing and residential strategy goals. And basically what we have shown here around the existing POCD are some of those strategies that were currently identified. Now, the important thing to note here is that, as I mentioned, the POCD is currently being updated and will be finished. The update will be finished by the end of the year. And the hope is that the housing strategies that get developed in the affordable housing plan will filter into the housing and residential strategies section of the updated POCD, so that there will be a linkage between the two. Looking at zoning, as many people probably are already well aware, the town is primarily zoned single family residential. It falls into two major zoning categories, one of R60 and the other being R80. And there is, in addition, there is obviously commercial and some other type of zoning along Main Street in the downtown, in the village center. And then the other area that is probably important to note is Heritage Village. Also has a little bit higher density housing zoning over in that area. There's also some other outlying village areas that have some commercial and some slightly higher, but majority of the town is single family. Now, on top of the zoning, we then look at infrastructure and specifically water service. And water service that's public is very limited to mainly the Heritage Village area, as well as along Main Street. But the remaining part of the town is served by individual well service. Sewer service also is an infrastructure item that kind of limits potential development. And public sewer is only offered again in some parts of the village center along Main Street, as well as in Heritage Village. Open space and current park and recreation, as well as protected open space, also gets overlaid and limits potential development. And then lastly is environmental constraints such as steep slopes, which are obviously very plentiful in the area. Also wetlands and wetland soils, as well as flood zones and floodplains that are associated with the rivers that flow around and through the community. When you add all these things together, as well as with the amount of development that has already taken place in the town over the last 100 years, there's very few open opportunities for additional land. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, but it just kind of limits our focus that the Planning Commission and the town can focus on. And takeaways from the zoning and buildable lands review, again, is that the majority of the town is single family zoned, which we all know. There's obviously infrastructure limitations and limiting public water and public sewer to only areas around Heritage Village and along Main Street and the main arterials. And that there's also a significant amount of natural constraints that also limit development. If we look at demographic trends, over the last 20 years, going back to 2000, the population was climbing at a slightly higher rate, but then it slowed down in 2010. And actually in the 2020 census that we're just now starting to get some of the information from, the population actually stayed stationary. It declined very slightly, but basically it stayed stationary in the last 10 years. In looking at projections that the state supplies us based on they're looking at trends, this stationary or stable population is supposed to continue for the next 20 years. So that's obviously important for us to consider. Now, when you look at age distribution, folks under the age of 15 have kind of stabilized, and there's not very much growth in that particular sector in the last 10 years. This has implications for for schools as well as for the community in going into the longer future. And also something to take a look at carefully is that folks in the 30 age group or young families has also shown some decline recently, and that trend might be continuing, and it might have to do with housing opportunities. Also not surprising is the baby boom generation, those age 65 and older, is starting to go up. I'm sorry, baby boomers are not all over 65 at this point, but I think it's about age 60 and older, but that age group is obviously starting to go up. And in the town, there's significant changes that are looming in the near future related to those over the age of 65. Currently, the population of over 65 is about 30%, and the projections indicate that this will continue to slowly rise over the next 20 years. If we look at actual household composition, the current Southbury household composition, or the size, the average size is 2.41 residents. And interesting, compared to the county and the state, there's a higher number of married couple households at 55%. But there's also a very high significant number of individual households, meaning and that's at 32%. And then over 68% of the households in town currently are either one or two persons. So it's a very high, significant number of smaller households. Now, we want to turn our attention briefly towards Heritage Village, because as we know that this might be one of the reasons why there's a higher percentage of one and two person households. And if you look at the graph that is shown at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that Heritage Village distribution of household size is shown in orange, and that is very high in the one and two person categories. Almost 100%, or at least 90-some% of all the households in Heritage Village are either one or two. When you look at Southbury as a whole, minus Heritage Village, which is in blue, you'll see that there's a little bit more of an even spread, but still, if you add the one and two person households together for the balance of Southbury, you'll still see that that's over just about 50% or higher. So let's talk about Heritage Village a little bit and how this community is unique within the state of Connecticut and also within Southbury. Heritage Village, for those that may not know, is the largest active adult community in the state of Connecticut, and it has a population currently of around just over 4,000. Heritage Village is also defined as its own census designated place. So therefore, it allows us to take a closer look at the town. We can take out Heritage Village or compare the two to see if there's any differences between what's going on in Heritage Village versus the town as a whole. Now, when we look at, and we notice that there is really a difference when you look at this, when you look at the median age, when you look at household income, and when you look at one or two person households that we just discussed. The median age in Heritage Village, not surprisingly, is at 73.6%, of age, and Southbury is 52.4. So there's almost a 20-year age difference there. In median income, you'll see that Heritage Village has a lower household income total than Southbury as a whole. And then also, as I mentioned at the previous slide, almost 95% of the households in Heritage Village are one or two persons. Next, we want to take a look at employment trends. And the town of Southbury currently has about 7,800 jobs currently. And the largest sector of that employment community is in health care and social assistance. 80% or 84% of workers commute from outside of town, as the table to the right indicates. So that means it's an interesting thing to consider, because while most people that live in Southbury are probably commuting out, and a lot of people that work in Southbury are commuting in. So that could be a sign that there might be somewhat of a mismatch of housing types within the community. If we look at the demographic takeaways, based on what I just talked about, we know that the population is currently stable, and it's projected to stay stable over the next 20 years. We also know that the age of those folks over the age of 65 is increasing. So we may want to look at additional options for them. And then the under 18 of age population is not growing, and that might be something that the town as a whole might want to take a look at. As far as household go, 68% consist of one or two persons when we look at the town as a whole. 55% of the current households are married couples. And that lastly, Heritage Village has a higher age and a smaller household size than the town as a whole. Okay, now we're going to take a look at housing market trends. And now this is also what is very interesting when you look at the town by itself and then compare it with or the town as a whole, and then take a look at what's going on in Heritage Village. And then if you take out the census tract area for Heritage Village, what does the remaining portions of Southbury take a look at with the types of units? Now, when we look at housing typology, what we're talking about is if it's single family all the way up to something that might be 10 or more units in a single building. When we look at Southbury as a whole on the left side of the screen, we'll see that it appears to be a very diverse housing typology, with only 57% being single family and the other almost 40% being a variety of different types of dwellings that are over single family. When we look at Heritage Village specifically, we'll see that there's all kind of diversity in Heritage Village, ranging from a few single family to 2 to 3 and higher types of units. But then when we take Heritage Village census tract out of the rest of the town, we'll see that the balance of Southbury is almost entirely single family detached housing at 88%. And there's only a small amount of housing types that aren't single family. Now, taking a deeper dive into housing typology, we want to take a look at if in each one of these units, what is the bedroom distribution? And this will be a clue to whether it matches well with the number of persons per household. In Heritage Village, almost 74% of the dwellings are, 63% of the units are 2 bedrooms and 23% are one bedrooms. So the clear majority of units in Heritage Village, not surprising, are either 1 or 2 bedrooms. But when we look at Southbury as a whole, or I'm sorry, Southbury without including Heritage Village, we see that the majority of the community is 3 or more bedrooms units, and that's almost 74%, which is not surprising since it has we have a large number of single-family detached units within the town. If we look at home values, and this is based on information from the US Census, we'll see that there is a range of values currently, which does indicate that there might be some naturally occurring availability of units. But if we, again, blue is Southbury without Heritage Village included, and then orange is Heritage Village by itself. So we can kind of look and see what the needs might be associated with those two different cohorts. And if we look at home sales trends, we'll see that single family homes prices have been relatively stable, although they did peak in 2016 prior to the recession around 2008 and 9, where prices went down. But then recently, as we're probably all aware, prices have been rising. And in 2021, a single family house, the median price hit an all-time high of $459,000, with condos not quite at the peak as prior to the 2008 recession, but they have rebounded to a median sale price of just above $200,000. Rent distribution, also there's a spread, and you can see that the spread between Heritage Village and then the balance of Southbury is somewhat different. However, there are fewer rental options within Southbury, and so this might also skew the numbers one way or the other since there's fewer rental opportunities. But Southbury without Heritage Village, almost 21% of rents are above $2,500 per month. And in Heritage Village, most of the rent falls between $1,000 to $2,000 range. Housing permits have also gone down and have somewhat stabilized from earlier peaks prior to 2005. And currently the town is averaging about 17 new housing permits in the last 5 years. Most of them have all been single family. And obviously there is a decrease when there's a decrease in available land. This is the reason why the number of permits has been decreasing. So the housing market trend takeaway is that related to housing typology, 88% of the town units within the town are single family detached homes, and that's without Heritage Village included. 74% of homes have 3 or more bedrooms, which means that they're larger units. And Heritage Village provides almost all of the town's diversity in housing. Related to sales and rents, the current median sale price of a home in Southbury is $459,000, and 21% of rentals are above $2,500. And at this point in last year for 2021, that we had a high of sale prices from in any time in the last 20 years. Okay, so with that, I'm going to take a little bit of a break and I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague Karen, and she's going to go through the housing needs assessment. And this is the last resource that we're going to review before we start talking about strategies.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Robert. Okay. So this last, as Robert said, is kind of the last information analysis based section of the presentation. Housing needs is going to go into talking about kind of tying together these concepts of all of the housing related information Robert just went over, and then tying it into looking at where does that leave unmet need when it comes to affordability in Southbury. So first, at the beginning of the presentation, Robert was talking about Connecticut State Statute 8-30G, and we talked about the 10% goal that the state has set for its municipalities to reach. One important thing to keep in mind is that the 8-30J Affordable Housing Plan process, which is what we're discussing tonight, and the document that we're looking to create does not explicitly focus on reaching that 10% goal. That 8-30J plan is intended to be more conceptual, a little bit more just in terms of strategies and goals and how you're going to go about just achieving greater housing affordability rather than hitting a specific number of affordable units. But because the two are in some ways tied together, there is this 10% goal that obviously communities are aware of and may or may not be striving to hit. So in that context, it is still important to keep it in mind or in the back of our heads. So the state does maintain a list of the number of protected affordable units in each town. If you remember from the beginning, the state is only keeping track of those units that qualify as protected, which means that they must be either by subsidy or deed restriction limited to households making less than 80% of area median income. So when we look at the list, those number of units compiled for Southbury, there are currently 137 protected affordable housing units in Southbury, which comes to about 1.47%. So based on the 10% goal, Southbury does have a ways to go. They do have a relatively small number of protected affordable units. Protected affordable units can be defined in a few different ways. There's a few different categories of them, some which you may or may not be familiar with. So things such as tenant rental assistance, those are things such as Section 8 vouchers, which you may be aware of that concept. In blue here, the 66% is governmentally assisted units. Those are typically the types of units you might find in a community's housing authority developments. And in orange are single family state or federal mortgage programs. So people who have utilized state or federal home buyer loans and mortgages and are using those to purchase an owned home would qualify that. So when you put all those together, they all qualify as protected housing, and Southbury has about 1.47% of its total stock. So next we're going to look at what is the amount of housing affordability need in Southbury. So we have three different gray boxes here, and they represent different income groups, but all of them are low income. There's varying degrees of low income. So on the left in blue, we have people who make between 50 and 80% of area median income, qualify as low income. In the middle in green, very low income households are those making 30 to 50% of AMI. And in orange, here we have extremely low income. Those are households making below 30% of the area median income. So we have facts and figures that are provided by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they give us these statistics for Southbury. So in each of these categories, we have the total number of households that fall under these categories, and we can break them down by homeowners and by renters. So for example, for low income, there are 870 households currently today in Southbury in this category. Then in the middle, 810 very low and 735 extremely low households. You can see that in Southbury, there are many more low-income homeowners than renters, but for the most part, that's a result of supply because you don't have nearly as many rental opportunities as homeowners. There are going to be much fewer renters that are low income than homeowners. So when you add these three figures at the bottom together, you get a total of 2,415 households in Southbury who meet the definition of low income earning under 80% of AMI. And that is totaling about 30% of your total population in Southbury today. So these are the same three boxes for the same categories. We've just swapped out the numbers here to show if you are a household that falls into these categories, how much could you afford to purchase a home for? So people who are interested in homeowner opportunities, can range anywhere from, for an individual who might be an extremely low income earner, they could afford to purchase a home of $74,000. At the other end would be a low income family of 4 could afford to purchase a home for $275,000. So just keep these numbers in mind when you think back to what Robert just presented about what the median sales price for a home in Southbury currently is. And these numbers are calculated so that these households would not be cost burdened, which is the concept we discussed earlier about not spending more than 30% of their monthly income on their housing. This is the same slide with the same figures, but we're looking at rents now. So if these same households wanted to rent, how much could they afford to spend per month on a rental unit? And again, a low of $469 per month to a high of $1,736 per month. And Robert had previously just showed us that rental chart where we saw that about 20% of rentals in Southbury are currently going for over $2,500. So again, just keep that in mind when we look at these limits. Just expanding a little bit more on that concept of cost burden, not spending more than 30% of your income on your housing costs, we can break that down and look at how different segments of the population are cost burdened. So the top chart here is breaking down different age groups and how cost burdened people in different age categories are. So here we can see that 65 years and older, so the senior population, is much more likely to be cost burdened. About 48% of seniors are experiencing cost burden, and for the younger income groups, that is lower. On the bottom here, we have renters versus owners, and renters are much more likely to be cost burdened than owners in Southbury. It is important to keep in mind that for the purpose of this, income is defined as monthly income that people earn on a monthly basis and would not include things such as savings or assets. So there could be, for example, especially for seniors, assets that they do have that are available to them. So there could be an inflation in this number, slightly false inflation, but still the theme is definitely still accurate. And then the state has recommended that we perform for each community as part of this 8-30J process, something called a housing gap analysis. So a housing gap analysis is a type of a calculation where you look at the existing affordable housing supply in a community. You compare it and subtract it from the affordable housing demand. So basically how many affordable housing units, and these would be naturally occurring affordable units. So how many housing units do you have that are potentially affordable to these groups? How many households do you have that need those types of units? And when you subtract them, you get a housing gap number. And that number is either going to be positive or negative. It's going to be positive if you have enough housing, and it's going to be negative if you don't have enough of that type of housing. So based on that calculation that we performed, and it produces a large chart that has a lot of numbers on it, that's pretty hard to digest. But the conclusions, the important kind of summary points of the housing gap analysis is that there are a lot of housing gaps in Southbury. So this chart is identifying all of the categories, all of the boxes that have an orange X in them are where there is not enough housing in Southbury. So you can actually see that there is a housing gap for virtually every category except both rental and owner units for families of 4 who are low income. And that kind of makes sense because you do have a lot of larger single family homes in Southbury. They may either be for owners or you may also have some rentals. And because Southbury has some naturally occurring affordability, but the prices are relatively high, it means that you do probably have some housing options for people who are low income, probably somewhere around that 80% AMI area, but you're less likely to have, as the income requirements get lower and lower, 50% AMI or 30% AMI. It's harder to have that type of housing availability, especially when you're not using any kind of federal subsidy or assistance. So that's why it's more likely that you have a gap. And then in terms of an individual versus a family of 4, as Robert was showing, there's a lot of households in Southbury today that are only 1 or 2 people, but you have mostly single family homes. So if you're an individual in Southbury and you're looking for an affordable home, you're going to struggle more than a family of 4, simply based on the stock that you have. So this is kind of just the summary of kind of where some of your unmet housing need exists today. So just in summary, we just have kind of a few key points here that kind of show what are some of the existing conditions, and then what does this kind of say about housing in Southbury today? So you can see from what we've covered that there were 2,415 low-income households in Southbury, but there are only 137 protected affordable units. We showed that an individual who makes 80% of area median income can afford a house, could afford to spend $1,216 in rent, but the median gross rent in Southbury right now is $1,587. Similarly, that same individual could afford a home of $192,000, and the median home value in Southbury is $325,000. Your average household size is 2.4, but 80% of your units have more than 3 bedrooms. So there's a mismatch there in terms of supply. And there are 7,800 jobs in Southbury, but currently 85% of your workers are living outside of town, which indicates that those workers may be struggling to find housing in the same place that they live. And I think I'm just going to turn it back over to Robert to move us into a little bit of the next section.
Thanks, Karen. So as we start to turn our attention to considering some strategies to get some feedback from you all tonight, we want to kind of talk a little bit about why pursuing housing strategies is important for the town as a whole. And again, you know, this is going to be guided by the overarching vision statements that are within and the goals within the POCD. But having housing strategies that diversify the potential housing stock within the town will help the town remain competitive in an ever-changing housing market. It also will potentially attract and retain jobs by having an increase in housing stock. It will also create housing or an economic prosperity for generational wealth and upward movement within families that already live in town so that they can stay in town. Diverse communities are also more resilient to change or disturbances that may come along. You know, if they have a variety of, that it's not all folks over 65, that there's a balance so that the culture of volunteerism in the state of Connecticut can continue, so that you can have young folks that would start to be volunteering for local services that would also help benefit the older generations that are within town. Obviously, having housing strategies would also help establish the next generation and help bring them, allow multi-generational households to maybe allow for an adult child to move out and get their own home, and then eventually move into a larger home as they start to have a family and grow. And then lastly, a housing market that remains strong and supports home values, which continue to grow, has implications in the town's grant list and millage rate and tax burdens. And obviously, making this sustainable helps the town in all of these types of categories. So with that, we're going to start talking about some potential strategies, and I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move into the portion of the presentation that really focuses on what content and strategies do we want in Southbury's 8-30J affordable housing plan. So there are a lot of different ways to approach creating housing options, opportunities, diversity, and housing affordability. You could go through a long list of strategies, but as we've explained, this is a plan that's supposed to be the beginning of the conversation. It will be updated every 5 years, but where do we want to start today? So like we said, there's a lot of strategies out there. There's a lot of approaches and options that are being taken across the state and across the country. But which ones make the most sense for Southbury? Obviously, the types of strategies to be chosen are things that should be feasible, that there would be an appetite in the community for. And that's what we want to do tonight. We want to hear kind of what types of strategies sound promising, favorable, and interesting to you. But with the help so far of the Planning and Zoning Commission and the land use staff, we've kind of given some initial consideration to some strategies that seem like they could potentially fit well in Southbury. So from kind of the large bucket or menu of potential housing strategies, of which there are many, we have kind of two categories. There are zoning related strategies and policy related strategies. These are two kind of key categories, themes of housing strategies. Zoning, of course, is kind of addressing the more tangible physical changes that a community can undertake that would allow for new housing options. And on the policy side, you have more programmatic or financially incentive-based strategies. So we have all these options. They fit in these two strategies. Which ones make sense for Southbury? So this evening, we would like to consider a few different 5 strategies we have kind of honed in on, and we're going to consider what those are. And I'm going to present them in one moment. So we have identified here my little one piece of my slide seems to be a little bit off, but we're going to identify 5 different strategies, and I'm going to explain what they are, and we're going to go through them, and then we're going to engage you in some questions about them, and so we will get started on that point right now. Okay, so we're now going to move into the live polling part of the presentation that we mentioned at the beginning. So in order to get involved and get started and ready with the polling, all you have to do is either have your smartphone, a tablet on hand, or if you're just on your computer and you just want to open a second window in a browser, you want to go to the URL pollev.com/SLR2021, and it should pop right up for you. You should see a black screen. It should have the SLR logo on it, and it should say kind of welcome to the polling, and it should work. You should see it pop up right there. Just make sure you don't exit out of the Zoom. If you open up a second window, just make sure that you can kind of have both open at the same time. In order to just test if this is working for everyone, we have one test question. It does not have anything to do with affordable housing or planning or zoning at all. But if you want to just test out this question, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? This will just give everyone a minute to get on board. Make sure the polling software is working for you. Looks like we've got a lot of people participating.
And just remember that
answers.
the site address is up at the top of the screen. So if you missed it in the last one and are still trying to log in, pollev.com/SLR2021 is at the top of the screen.
Excellent. Okay. Probably a few answers trickling in, but this is the general gist of how it's going to go. We're going to ask you some different questions about the information and content we're about to present, and it will be great to get all of your spontaneous feedback. Okay.
It's kind of interesting that chocolate and mint chocolate chip are tied with the number of people participating.
Strawberry is not as popular. I was rooting for strawberry, but
I think Stop and Shop is going to take a look at this and make sure that they stock more chocolate ice cream in Southbury.
Okay, so hopefully everyone's gotten the hang of it. So now that you did hear the previous part of our presentation, after hearing the presentation that we just gave, do you feel that you have a better understanding of housing affordability, particularly as it relates to Southbury, but also in general? Okay, so we've got about 90, 95, oh, only 90. Okay, So obviously, a large hope for this presentation was to try to offer a lot of education and background information that explains what housing affordability, affordable housing, and these concepts in the context of Southbury and the purpose of the developing the affordable housing plan document are. So thank you, and we hope it was helpful. So now to move into the strategy portion, as I mentioned, we have narrowed in for the purpose of this evening 5 potential housing strategies that Southbury could pursue. These are 5 that, like as I said, we discussed with the Planning and Zoning Commission, we discussed with staff, and we think that they might have an appropriate role and place in Southbury. And we want to be able to tell you a little bit more about them, how they could potentially be used and implemented in Southbury, and then hear your feedback. So we're going to look at these concepts: accessory dwelling units, the concept of adaptive reuse, adapting, repurposing existing buildings. Number 3, the concept of housing overlay zones, which can target new affordable units in appropriate areas of a community. Number 4, promoting the idea of first-time homebuyer education so that perhaps more people can take advantage of first-time homebuyer financing assistance. And number 5, the concept of cluster subdivisions for the purpose of preserving green space in Southbury. So for each strategy that I present, I'm going to give a quick outline of what it is. I'm going to give a possible case study, maybe somewhere else in the state of Connecticut or elsewhere where this strategy has been used. And then I'll talk a bit about how it could be applied in Southbury. So the first strategy, number 1, is accessory dwelling units, which are also known as ADUs. You may be familiar with this concept. It might be the most widespread and most known of all of them. It's especially gotten a lot of kind of talking points in the last couple of years in the state of Connecticut. Accessory dwelling units are small apartments that exist as secondary housing units on the same property as a single family home. The graphic on the bottom shows examples of different types and forms of accessory dwelling units. A lot of people might be familiar with them as small units that come attached to a single family home. They can also be detached from a single family home. They could be in a basement in a lower level. They could be above an attached or a detached garage. Someone could convert their garage into an accessory dwelling unit. So they take on a lot of styles and forms. Accessory dwelling units, because they're typically small, they're typically intended for only 1 or 2 people and small in size. They offer naturally affordable housing options. If someone chooses to rent out an accessory dwelling unit on their property, that can also provide them with additional income, which can then also reduce their overall housing costs. So there can be some twofold benefits for sure. The ADUs wouldn't count towards the state's protected affordable housing unless they were deed restricted to be affordable. That is a potential option. And Southbury does currently allow accessory dwelling units. The land use department gave us some information that Southbury has permitted about 1 to 4 accessory dwelling units per year over the past of each of the past 5 years. So they are an option currently in Southbury. And we're talking here about what some options for kind of making them more utilized through Southbury could be. So knowing that ADUs are something that are an option and allowable in Southbury, the regulations for accessory dwelling units are actually quite permissive, and they do allow for property owners of single family homes to take advantage and put an ADU on their property. The regulations were updated in the fall of 2020. And yet they're still minimally utilized. As you saw, only a handful of people are putting in ADUs on their property each year. So what are some ways that Southbury could explore additional opportunities to spread the awareness and the education of this as a housing option for people, especially a naturally occurring affordable option and something that people could need? As we were talking before, the household size in Southbury is shrinking, and there are a lot of people falling into that 1 to 2 person household category. So for them, an ADU could be an appropriate housing option. Like we said, they're typically small and they are well designed and apt for 1 to 2 people. So there could be a match there between people who are looking for housing and people who might want to take advantage of an accessory dwelling unit. So Southbury could explore options such as additional handouts. They could make a brochure about accessory dwelling units, what they are, how they can be implemented, how you can take advantage of one. There could be a web page on the planning department website that promotes them. Something like an FAQ page that gives people additional information, especially the zoning aspect. Sometimes anything that relates to zoning can be kind of complicated and intimidating to people. So if it could explain how you can utilize getting a zoning permit for an accessory dwelling unit, people might be able to take advantage more readily and more easily and put an accessory dwelling unit on their property if they were interested. So strategy number 1 here is kind of an educational and awareness tool to expand an already positive existing regulation that you have on the books in Southbury, but just trying to make it possible for more people to take advantage. So we have a polling question here. How familiar are you with accessory dwelling units? Do you have an ADU on your property? Do you know someone with an ADU? Maybe you've heard of them. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing about them. So let us know. Okay. So quite a few people have heard of accessory dwelling units. Like I said, they're a little trendy in recent years, and people, you do hear about them in the news. Maybe you read about them in a magazine or something like that. But it looks like 30% of people actually say that they know someone in Southbury with an ADU, but not many people have one on their own property. So again, a good reason why expanding kind of the knowledge and opportunities would definitely be beneficial, I think. So would you support this concept of exploring ways to promote ADUs as a housing option in Southbury? How do you feel about expanding those opportunities? So awesome. So a lot of people say that they would be in favor. Some people are a little unsure. A small number don't feel that they would be comfortable, but this is very helpful. So it's really great to hear this types of feedback. As we know, the regulations have, been in existence and updated recently. And it would be helpful if more people kind of knew what the option was. So excellent, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna move on to strategy number 2 here. Strategy number 2 is the concept of adaptive reuse. So adaptive reuse is reusing existing buildings for new purposes other than their original purpose. And in this case, we would be talking about that new purpose being housing, and ideally affordable housing. So the concept of adaptive reuse promotes infill development. So this is development that's taking place on properties that already have been developed. So one benefit here is that we're not developing undeveloped property. Green space and open space is not impacted because these properties have already held an existing use on them. There are existing services. They would probably already be served by local infrastructure and utilities, and you just get to take advantage of what's already there, but give the building a new use and a new life. It can include both residential and non-residential structures can be converted into housing. There's a great historic preservation benefit because you get to keep the existing structure and its architectural details and integrity, but just give it a new use. And there's environmental and cost savings benefits because you don't have to go through the process of tearing down a building and rebuilding it from scratch. A couple different examples exist throughout the Northeast for sure, where obviously there's a large stock of historic buildings and structures. This is an example in a small suburb in Massachusetts, where a vacant church on the left was no longer being utilized. It went up for sale. It dated back to the late 1800s, and someone did purchase it and restore it into 2 residential condo units in 2008. You can see on the right the newly redeveloped residential structure. This was located in a residential neighborhood, located near amenities, and they kept all of the existing architectural details of the church on the inside and incorporated them into the housing units. A different example, and one that's even a little closer geographically, is the Lofts at Spencer's Corners in Essex. A local housing nonprofit called the Hope Partnership modernized and updated this previously existing commercial building. They were actually commercial condo units on the bottom, but there were a large number of vacancies and the building was just underutilized. So they converted a portion of the building into 17 affordable units. So it's now a mixed use project with some retail and office on the first floor and apartments above on the second floor, constructed with federal and local funding, targeted at young families and households that are making between 30% and 80% of AMI. So if Southbury were to consider something like this, it could involve something that looks like developing a set of zoning regulations to create standards, allowing residential uses in some non-residential areas. You can identify the types of buildings and the uses that you might be interested in looking at. Then there could be a review of any potentially vacant or unused structures in the town. There could be bonuses if these types of structures could be deed restricted as affordable. And like I said, in the previous example, collaborating with local housing nonprofits can be a good and productive way to kind of go about achieving this. So would you or could you potentially support repurposing vacant structures in Southbury into housing units? Obviously, this is a hypothetical question. If there was an appropriate vacant structure that was not being utilized, taking into consideration what that might look like, would you be possibly interested in seeing that explored? So it looks like about 80% of people are saying they would potentially like this strategy. Maybe about 10% are not sure. Maybe 12% or so are not in favor. Okay, that's very helpful. Then just a little more specifically, if we are looking at the types of structures, are there certain ones that you could see having interest in adapting into housing? Looks like people are definitely interested in churches. There's definitely some great examples out there. Also commercial buildings, any schools or former institutional buildings that may become vacant. There is also the option, there could be things like large historic kind of oversized mansions or homes that if they're just too large for today's households and kind of oversized, they also can be converted into multiple residential units. So great.
It's a
Thank
horse
you.
race.
Keeps jumping up, but
Look at that.
excellent.
It's like completely even right now.
There we go. So like
That's
30%.
interesting.
Yeah, and you could choose more than one here. So whichever ones were of interest. Excellent. Cool. Okay, strategy number 3 is the concept of a housing overlay zone. So housing overlay zone is a type of zoning ordinance that creates an additional layer on top of your existing zoning. So nothing about your underlying zoning changes. It remains completely the same. But on top of the existing zoning that you do have, you add an additional layer that is an incentive zone for affordable housing in a specified targeted area. So if you were to create an overlay zone and target it to lay on top of a specific area of Southbury, you would then set a set of incentives that would target affordable housing to be created in that zone. There could be incentives set that could be something like a density bonus, a greater allowable height, lower parking requirements, or kind of an expedited permitting process. And it can also allow for housing in locations that would otherwise not be zoned for residential uses. So if you would like to target housing in a mixed use kind of setting, closer to the village, the town center, or some type of commercial area, and you'd like to see higher density there rather than in a single family neighborhood, that area could become a housing overlay zone. And you would incentivize developers to place housing there by putting some of these kind of menu of incentives in place. It offers developers more flexibility in developing more housing with more choices, which would then result in more supply but the town has the control over where it's going because it's the one that identified where the zone goes. So an example that's not too far away is in Ridgefield. In 2018, the Ridgefield Planning and Zoning Commission adopted a mixed use overlay zone where they wanted to target specifically mixed use type development in their town's already existing business zone. The regulation permits a maximum of 16 units per acre if the developer includes 30% of units that are deed restricted as affordable. It has to be a mixed use development, so the commercial has to remain on the first floor and the housing can be above it. It does allow for some reduced parking requirements, acknowledging that it's located in the center of town. This is a project on the right that took advantage of the overlay zone, and this is actually residential units above the first floor is a self-storage facility in the center of town in one of their business districts with the apartments located above. And how to go about doing this. There are similarities in housing overlay zones to some existing types of zoning that Southbury already has, such as your planned development districts or units, PDDs or PDU zones. The concepts are somewhat similar. You identify a geographic area for the housing overlay zone based on community feedback. You select the percentage of affordable units that you'd like to see required. That would qualify the project and what type of incentive package you'd like to offer. And you kind of shape and develop the regulations that way to target the housing into specific areas of Southbury. So do you feel that there are areas of Southbury that could appropriately be identified as housing overlay zones? So we've got about 60%, a little more. People say that they could potentially see some areas in Southbury that this could be appropriate. 16% or so say no, and 20% are not quite sure. It can be hard to kind of know and kind of see and envision how some of these strategies do work. And that's why this is definitely just the beginning of the conversation, where we're just kind of presenting these original ideas, and additional feedback and consideration are definitely necessary. But it's really great to get your initial impressions. So that's very helpful. So overall, do you feel that you could support housing overlay zones as a strategy to incentivize housing affordability in Southbury? So pretty similar breakdown with similar numbers of people potentially supporting this idea. So that's great. Excellent. Thank you. And everyone has definitely gotten the hang of the polling software. So, okay. The next strategy was kind of shifting over to the policy side. And this was the one related to promoting these first-time homebuyer mortgages. So the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, CHFA, is a state agency that provides first-time homebuyer loans and mortgages for people who are looking to buy homes that fall into certain lower price limits, and for people who earn certain lower incomes. And if you qualify, you're able to get these first-time mortgages, typically at lower market interest rates. The agency has some really cool statistics where you can go in and look at how many of these mortgages have been issued in your town. So in Southbury, over the last 5 years, there have been 15 CHFA mortgages approved for people whose median household income has been $75,000. The average loan amount is about $166,000. The average age of a recipient is 48, and the average household size is 1.5, with 67% of these going to people who are single households. And that's really interesting because it kind of ties back to how there is a lot of that need in Southbury for individuals to be able to have housing options. So you can see that those are a lot of people who might be targeted through this type of CHFA program. The sales prices for the units that these people purchased ranged anywhere from $80,000 to $265,000. So again, these are people who are looking for these lower income and lower priced homes and have those types of needs. The graph shows a breakdown of how many people in Southbury use their loan to purchase either a single family house or a condo. So it's probably likely that a lot of the people in that blue condo section might have been in Heritage Village, just considering the breakdown of the town. But it's very interesting to see some of this data. So the strategy here is, again, an educational and a policy-based one about spreading information and spreading knowledge and awareness. So the idea that we know that these mortgages are an option and an opportunity for people, but are the people who need them being connected, and are they aware that this is even an option for them? And what could Southbury do to promote this? So there's a lot of different ways that the town could go about doing that. Some of the ways it could be achieved would be to develop different strategies to share the information and to encourage potential home buyers to consider and pursue CHFA mortgages. This could look like hosting or advertising home buyer education classes in town, partnering with housing nonprofits or other local towns to provide possibly a housing counselor or a housing liaison point person in the town. And different things like that. You could distribute educational flyers or materials in the library and town hall. You could speak to realtors in the community and make sure that they're well-versed and knowledgeable about CHFA mortgages. So if people come into their offices and ask about first-time homebuyer options, the realtors have the correct and accurate information to promote and pursue and connect people with these options. So this is more of an educational type campaign, but people who take advantage of these CHFA mortgages, these count towards the 10% protected affordable units if you have purchased a home that qualifies. And so that can actually raise the number of protected affordable units in Southbury. So do you feel that you could like to see Southbury promote these types of opportunities for first-time homebuyers? So it looks like a little bit above 80% or so of people would like to see this. 12% say no. Not too many people are unsure. Awesome. What types specifically of these types of programs would you like to see Southbury potentially utilize? Okay, people like the idea of educating realtors, identifying a housing liaison, hosting workshops. Awesome. Okay. Definitely the realtor one, definitely, I think is a good tool. Great. Okay, the last one, and I will try to wrap this up quickly. These are cluster subdivisions. So you may be familiar with a traditional subdivision. That's the picture on the top. Large lots, each with one single family home on them. The idea of a cluster subdivision is the same concept, but it's basically shrunk, where all of the homes are on small lots and a large remainder of the overall property remains as green open space. So basically the layout is changed and it reduces the development costs of the overall development, and the associated infrastructure and associated costs can lead to being able to charge slightly less for the homes themselves. So there is some kind of direct connection between cost and home prices in cluster subdivisions. Also, the key behind it is preserving the remainder of the lot as open space, which fulfills conservation goals, and that property can then be protected as protected open green space for their community. So it doesn't decrease the overall density of the development, it just redistributes it in different ways. There are multiple examples of this type of subdivision development across Connecticut. This is an example in Guilford, the Great Hill Cottage community. There's 10 small homes on this property, and they actually were all deed restricted as affordable. So when you see the layout there on the right of the map and design of the subdivision, you can see that they're all clustered in one area and the remainder remains as green space. You know, again, this is an opportunity for smaller, potentially single family homes, which kind of fits in a little bit more with the kind of traditional home layout and typology in a place like Southbury, but also has a lot of advantages and aligns with the goals of your plan of conservation and development, particularly when it comes to protecting open space. So a way to go about achieving this is a potential update or addendum to the subdivision regulations, where you develop the thresholds to identify the property sizes and infrastructure requirements for the lots. You include provisions for the ongoing maintenance of open space and set standards for this type of subdivision, and can potentially implement this as an opportunity. So do you think that cluster subdivisions could help Southbury achieve housing goals while maintaining its rural character? Got about 3/4 or so that say yes. Awesome. Excellent. Okay, just the last question is our just final wrap-up question. You've now seen 5 strategies that we've proposed as potential housing strategies for Southbury. The Poll Everywhere software will allow you to assign a ranking to each one, and you can rank each one from 1 through 5, with 1 being the most desirable in your opinion and 5 being the least desirable. And you can plug that in and we will see how people felt. So it looks like the homebuyer education was the, oh, they're swapping.
Yeah, it'll probably take a while. This one's a
Yeah,
little
while
bit, takes a little
everyone
longer.
collects their responses, we'll give everyone a chance.
Is this the one, Karen, on the phone where you have to tap it?
You
get
tap the
option?
little white box with the arrows to assign each one a value. I know it's the most complex question for sure. So it looks like ADUs were many people's first choice. People also definitely like adaptive reuse and the first-time homebuyer education. The housing overlay zones may definitely be the least preferable of people tonight. So that's great. This is super helpful information. It's really, really great to hear and kind of get this spontaneous feedback. Like we said, we know we've thrown a lot of information out at people to absorb in a small amount of time. And this is kind of just the initial, you know, you're hearing it for the first time and trying to absorb it and answer the questions. So thank you so much for kind of running with the punches. But it's really helpful information, and we are able to collect and download all of these results and include them as we move forward with the planning process. The poll does stay live for a little bit even after we stop. So even if you want to keep answering, you can, even if we're just going to jump forward. So I know we can wrap up as quickly as possible.
Okay. Yeah, you wanted me to start talking about next steps?
Yeah, why don't we move to the next steps?
So obviously this workshop tonight was an important step in us working with the Planning Commission to get the affordable housing plan for the next 5 years underway for the town of Southbury. I think all the information that we have presented, as well as all the feedback that we've received from the audience tonight, is actually very good information for the Planning Commission, as well as us, in assisting them in further refining the strategies. So after tonight's meeting, we're obviously going to continue to answer the questions that came in on the workshop tonight. We're also going to continue to refine and discuss the action steps with the Planning Commission. Later on in the spring, just prior to April, the first draft of the Affordable Housing Plan will be available. It'll be available for public review at that time for additional comments as we start to wrap it up. And then obviously the adoption will be happening in advance of the June 1st. We're hoping that you can stay involved, and updates will be posted on the Southbury town website if you follow that link. That link can be found, I think it's on Jessica, is that correct? Is it on the town, the land use department's page? Is that right?
Yeah, it's actually, if you go under the planning department, it's under the affordable housing link.
Okay.
Right.
And
So we
then,
posted there.
right. And in addition to getting updates, you can also go back and take a look at information about affordable housing that we presented at the beginning of the presentation. And there's more information about the different types of units and the different types of affordable housing that the state is suggesting that we consider. You also can continue to submit questions. There's an email address that's on the screen there, which is webmaster@southbury-ct.gov. If you have questions that you come up with after the presentation and you want to submit, we can add them to the questions that we've been accumulating tonight. And then we will post answers to these questions and we'll post that to the website in the next couple of weeks once we have a chance to get through them all. With that, I know we have gotten kind of late kind of quickly. Did you have any questions, Jessica, that came in on the question and answer that you'd like for us to answer tonight? Or would you, what are your suggestions at this point?
One of the simple questions that came through was if these slides would be made available on our town website. And I don't believe that you and I discussed that. Will they be available to Southbury residents?
Yes, yep, we can definitely make that available so that it can be viewed by others. Obviously with the Planning Commission's blessing on that, and that we can supply that to you in the next couple of days so that it will be a available link on the story map.
Okay, Richard, were there any questions that stood out to you that would be simple to answer right now?
There were a lot of it that we answered along the way here. There's like
I know.
lot
Thank
in the-
you
a
also
lot
for
in the
doing
queue.
that.
It's
there's, I
hard to
mean,
keep up. There was a lot of them.
over 130 or 40 people on. There's a lot of questions here hovering in. Let's just see here. There's a bunch of them. The gross, were the incomes based on, this is one of the questions, were the incomes based on gross or net income for your low income, for the affordable housing numbers?
Yeah, for AMI, it's based on gross.
Okay. All right. Has Southbury already accepted federal state funds for this type of housing? Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
Jeff,
I mean,
did you know?
the town doesn't have a housing authority, so I don't think
Yeah.
you'd be able to be eligible for that.
Right. Let's see. What is a bonus and how are they funded?
You mean like a density bonus?
Yeah,
or something?
density bonus.
I'm assuming this is just the very generic question that came in. It wasn't, that was the,
Yeah,
Both
I mean,
of
a
the
density bonus, those are usually, an incentive offer that's being offered to a developer. If you, follow the established regulations, and take advantage of some of these programs, could be a couple of that we discussed, such as the housing overlay zone. The incentive bonus for the developer is that they're going to get an extra amount of units. And usually that obviously is an incentive for a developer to pursue that opportunity. It would still be, being developed and funded by the developer, but because they can recoup more by having a larger number of units, they're more likely to want to take advantage of the opportunity or the regulation. And that's kind of how those types of bonuses typically work. So it's not outside funding, it's still the developer, but it helps their total bottom line numbers when they can build more units. So they like taking advantage of bonuses, which typically helps the overall concept.
great. All right, excellent, Karen, thanks. Here's another question. Can regulations be created which require developers to dedicate a much higher percentage of units to affordable housing than the current 15%?
Well, the current 15% that's not in the town's regulations currently, is it? So I think that usually there's a range of affordable housing percentage in a development. It can range from, I think, 10% all the way to 30. But that's also something that would be, if the town decided to go down the route to have something like that, or maybe in like the housing overlay, where there would be a series of guide points that would be set up in that regulation, and the town would decide what that rate would be. And yes, it definitely could be higher or lower than 15%, depending on what the town's desires were for that particular change to
Right.
the zoning code.
Yeah, under 8-30G, for example, it's 30%. It doesn't typically go higher than 30% because it is difficult to financially support a project with a much higher percentage of affordable units. But depending on the different types of resource or funding opportunities that could be available, the number definitely could go higher. You can find fully affordable units, but again, those usually have some type of government funding coming into place. So somewhere between the 10 to 30% range is pretty typical if you're just looking at a developer set aside development.
Great. There's a lot of questions in the queue, so maybe we should just have to answer them all by email or get back to everybody.
Yeah, I see there's even more popping up. So
They're popping up like crazy.
yeah, so I mean, we discussed that we can save and take note. We will have a record and copy of all of the questions. And what we can do is we can go through and create a Word document that gives all of the questions and types out all of the answers. And then we will post that along with, probably in the
Yes.
same place we put the copy of the presentation itself, so that if people want to go revisit it later, they can look at the presentation, they can read through that, and then they can click on and see all of the transcription of the chat questions with our answers inserted answering the questions.
Yeah, I think that'll be the best here, and then we can get them all answered for everybody, because there's a lot of them
At
still
once,
popping
yep.
in.
I
Okay,
see
great.
that.
All right, excellent. Anything else from your end from the presentation? If not, we can,
No, we just like to thank everybody.
Thank everybody.
participating. There was a very high participation tonight. I think we got up into like the 130 range, which is good for folks taking time out of their night to listen to us talk. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope that everybody continues to stay involved, and we'll look for future engagement with the Planning Commission, as well as further down the road with what's on the website.
great. All right, thank you, Karen and Robert. We appreciate your time tonight. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yes,
Jessica,
thank you.
Jessica, thank you
to
for setting this
the
up.
Planning Commission as well for all your hard work. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a
Okay,
good night.
good night.
Have a great night.